They said she was chasing ghosts, but the truth was simpler. She was just looking for a door that still opened. Rain had followed her for 2 days straight, the slow, soaking kind that felt less like weather and more like judgment. Every town she passed through smelled of diesel, wet concrete, and the quiet pity people carried for anyone who looked like her. A woman with a torn backpack, a sleeping bag rolled too tight, and a dog with ribs you could count like beads. The kind of pair people noticed only long enough to look away. Her name was Clara Hensley, and she was 38 years old the day she decided to stop walking and go back to where her story had started, a place her mother never wanted to talk about, a place she'd only seen once, in a photograph her grandfather kept on the wall of his small nursing home room. A gray house crouched under pine trees, a caption scrawled in pencil on the back, "Home, before the mistake." When he died, the house vanished from conversation entirely. But Clara had always felt it, some invisible tether humming through her chest, tugging whenever she thought about him. She'd promised herself she'd find it someday, not for closure, but for proof that she still belonged to something that had walls. She found it almost by accident, a half-buried listing on an old county property map, address nearly rubbed out by mildew. The search took her north, away from highways and light, until the signal on her phone died, and only the road remained. Jasper trotted ahead of her, tail down but steady, ears twitching toward every sound. He had the kind of face that could break your heart just by waiting. They'd been together for 3 years, since the shelter behind the grocery store, since the night she'd shared her last sandwich and somehow gained a friend. When the trees opened up and she saw the house, she stopped. It was smaller than the picture, or maybe the years had grown around it. The roof sagged under moss. The porch leaned on one good beam, and the windows were blind with dust. But the shape of it, the steep pitch of the roof, the stone chimney, the heavy wooden door, it was exactly as she remembered from the photograph. She stood there, soaked to the bone, trying to feel something. Relief, maybe, or grief. What came instead was a strange calm. "Guess we found it," she said. Her voice sounded foreign. Jasper sniffed the steps, then looked back at her as if to ask whether they were really going inside. The door opened easier than it should have. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and rainwater. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper patterned like pressed leaves. Furniture was sparse. A single chair, a table tilted on one leg, and a clock that had stopped at 2:17. She ran her fingers over the mantel, tracing the thin line where dust had been disturbed, maybe by mice, maybe by memory. There were photographs, too, some fallen face down, some still standing. One caught her eye, a young man in military uniform, his smile too formal to be real, her grandfather. Behind him, a woman with kind eyes but a weary mouth, her grandmother, who died long before Clara was born. She turned the frame over, a note in the same careful hand. "If you forget everything else, remember where the key is." The words chilled her, though she didn't know why. She set her backpack down and sat on the floor, the dog curling up beside her. The silence of the house was heavy, but not empty. It was listening. Morning arrived gray and reluctant. Fog rolled in from the ridge, pressing against the windows. Clara made coffee on a camping stove, the smell cutting through the damp like a small defiance. She watched the dog chase a squirrel that didn't exist, his paws kicking up mud. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to find here. The deed had said the house was long abandoned, taxes unpaid for decades. But something about it didn't feel lost. It felt paused, waiting for someone to finish the story. In the corner by the fireplace, she found a loose floorboard. It wasn't hidden well, more like someone had expected it to be found. Underneath lay a small wooden box, its edges softened by time. She lifted it out carefully, her pulse unsteady. Inside, she expected photographs or letters. Instead, she found coins. Not many, maybe a dozen, tarnished but heavy, stamped with dates from the 1930s. Beneath them, folded carefully, a note. For the one who finds what I couldn't spend. The value isn't in the metal, it's in the weight. There was no signature, but she knew the handwriting. She sat there a long time, turning one of the coins over in her hand. It wasn't gold or rare. She could tell that much. Still, it had a gravity to it, the kind of thing people keep, not because it's worth something, but because it reminds them they once had something to keep. Later, as she explored the house, she found the basement door, locked with a rusted padlock. The chain was thin enough to break, but she hesitated. The memory of her grandfather's voice came uninvited, the way it sometimes did in dreams. Some doors, Clara, are locked for the right reasons. But curiosity is a hunger that doesn't ask permission. She took a rock from the garden, struck the chain twice, and it gave way. The hinges groaned. The air that came out smelled of iron and damp wood. Jasper whined but followed her down. The basement was smaller than she imagined. Low ceiling, dirt floor, walls lined with shelves of glass jars turned opaque with dust. But there, in the far corner, half buried in earth, stood a safe. It was massive, the kind banks used to use. The door bore a nameplate, almost rusted smooth. Hensley & Comer, 1932. Clara's breath caught. Her grandfather had told her once about his father, a man who'd owned a small construction company that went under during the Depression. He buried more than his dreams, he'd said once, and then never spoken of it again. She knelt by the safe. The combination dial was still intact, the handle stiff but movable. She spun it gently, feeling the subtle clicks through her fingertips. A sound like a heartbeat buried in metal. "Grandpa," she whispered, "what were you keeping down here?" That night, the wind shifted. Rain turned to sleet, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. The power of memory in an old house is strange. It can make silence sound like breathing. Clara lay awake on the floor beside Jasper, watching shadows move across the ceiling. She thought about the safe, about the coins, about how her life had somehow come full circle to a place she didn't remember, but that still remembered her. When sleep came, it brought a dream. Her grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, counting something invisible on his fingers. "They'll never see the real number," he said. "It's not money, Clara. It's everything we didn't spend." She woke with tears she didn't understand. By morning, the storm had passed. She made another pot of coffee and decided to go back to the basement. The safe looked the same, but the air around it felt different, lighter, almost expectant. She tried the dial again, spinning slowly, listening for the shift in tone that meant a mechanism was waiting to click. On the third turn, she heard it, faint, deliberate, then another. And then, the handle moved. The door creaked open. Inside wasn't money, not gold, not bonds, not treasure in the ordinary sense. It was paper, stacks of journals, ledgers, folded letters, all wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled one free. The first page was dated 1941. If you're reading this, it means time has decided to return something to you. What you hold isn't fortune, it's accounting of debts not owed in dollars. The handwriting was her grandfather's. As she flipped through the pages, she realized what she was holding. A record of every man her great-grandfather had underpaid. Every debt he had tried to erase when the company failed. Every name he'd written down with a promise to repay when I can. The final page held a calculation. Numbers scrawled in pencil, added and re-added. At the bottom, a total. $130,000. The number was impossible. She read the note beneath it. Adjusted for time, for suffering, for inheritance of silence. If worth could measure guilt, this would be our family's ledger. Clara's hands trembled. It wasn't money he'd hidden. It was weight. The weight of what generations had chosen not to face. A fortune measured in regret. She spent the rest of the day reading page after page, story after story. Workers who died building bridges, families ruined when the company went under, names erased, but remembered here, in secret ink. Her grandfather must have spent his later years compiling it all, carrying the debt forward as if memory itself could balance the books. By dusk, she felt both crushed and freed. The house, the safe, the rain, they all felt like witnesses. She took the last ledger, set it on the table, and lit the single candle she'd found in the drawer. The flame flickered over the page, highlighting words that seemed written just for her. You, whoever finds this, don't try to pay it. Just understand it. Wealth isn't what we leave. It's what we stop carrying. She exhaled. For the first time in years, her body felt light. Jasper lifted his head, sensing the change. She smiled faintly. Guess we found the treasure, huh? The dog wagged his tail once, slow, steady, as if to say yes, and maybe it was time to rest. Clara looked around the room. At the peeling wallpaper, the damp floor, the safe that no longer hid anything. She thought of the world outside, the people rushing past her on sidewalks, the years she'd spent invisible, the small kindnesses that had kept her alive. Maybe the value wasn't gone. Maybe it had just been waiting for her to name it. She took one of the coins from the box and set it on the ledger, right beside the number, $130 million, and whispered, "Paid." Outside, the wind softened. The fog rose, revealing the edge of the forest, sharp and new. The mountain didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt awake. And as she stood in the doorway, the first sunlight in days touching her face, Clara realized the real inheritance wasn't buried gold or family guilt. It was permission to stop running, to forgive the weight she never asked to carry, and to start measuring her life not by what she'd lost, but by what she'd learned to keep. She turned back to the dog and smiled. "Come on, partner. Let's stay a while." She stayed. That was the first decision in years that didn't come from fear. The next morning, she swept the dust into a single pile, found a hammer in the shed, and started patching the boards that moaned in the night. The work steadied her. The rhythm of nails, the rasp of the broom, the creak of the wood. These were sounds a person could live by. Jasper followed her from room to room, tail low, as if guarding the act of rebuilding. When she caught her reflection in the window, the woman looking back didn't seem quite so lost. Her shoulders had stopped curling inward, and the lines around her eyes looked less like exhaustion and more like maps. Days turned into a pattern. She would wake with the light, make a small fire, walk the perimeter of the property, then sit at the table and read a few more pages of the journals. The words kept shifting in weight. They began as confessions, but as she read, they changed into something else. A record of people trying to name what they owed to one another. It was a strange kind of accounting. A man paying for a widow's rent with the labor of his own back. A woman feeding the workers even after she had nothing left to sell. Each story felt like a seed buried under guilt that had sprouted anyway. In one of the later entries, her grandfather's handwriting had grown uneven. If you are reading this, you may think I was obsessed with numbers, but numbers are how I remembered faces. They gave shape to the apologies I didn't know how to speak. Below that, he had drawn a small symbol, 2 circles overlapping. She found the same mark carved faintly into the edge of the table where she sat. It wasn't decoration. It was intention, like he'd left her a compass that didn't point north, only inward. That evening, she walked to the creek at the back of the property. The air was clean and cold, and the water reflected the sky like steel. Jasper waded in, barking at his own reflection. She sat on a rock and pulled the coin from her pocket. It had lost none of its weight, though she'd held it so often it had warmed to her touch. "You know," she said softly, "maybe this is what he meant. Maybe value isn't what you find. It's what you finally stop hiding." The forest answered with its usual quiet. She dropped the coin into the water. It landed without a splash, disappeared under the current, and she felt something loosen in her chest. On the 3rd week, a truck appeared at the end of the drive. A man stepped out, thin and gray-bearded, with a clipboard and a county badge. He introduced himself as Paul, the property assessor. He was polite but distant, the way people are with strangers who make them nervous. He'd heard someone had moved into the old Hensley place and came to confirm. Clara invited him inside. He hesitated at the threshold, perhaps expecting decay or danger, but when he saw the candlelight, the swept floors, and the kettle on the stove, his face softened. "You've done something good here," he said. "I'm just cleaning," she replied. He nodded, though his eyes caught on the open safe in the corner. "Find anything worth keeping?" She smiled faintly. "Depends on what you mean by worth." Paul chuckled, but when she handed him one of the journals, his humor fell away. He turned a few pages, brow furrowing, and said quietly, "I knew one of these men. My grandfather used to tell stories about this company. Said the owner disappeared before paying half his workers." "He didn't disappear," Clara said. "He just didn't know how to come back." Paul exhaled, long and low. He closed the book carefully. "You should take these to the Historical Society. They'll want to see this, make a record of it. It's worth something." The word worth hung between them. He meant it kindly, but she could tell he didn't understand. The world still thought value was something you could file or count. She just nodded. "Maybe later." Before he left, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Found this in the county archives. It was misfiled under probate from the 80s. It's addressed to a Clara Hensley. I figured it couldn't hurt to bring it." Her pulse stuttered. She took it with both hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her grandfather's, shaky but deliberate. After he drove away, she sat at the table for a long time, staring at the envelope. Jasper whined softly, sensing her hesitation. Finally, she opened it. Inside was a single page, folded twice. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. Clara, if you found the house, it means you were brave enough to go where I couldn't. The world called our debt money, but money was only the language of our fear. What we truly owed was honesty and courage. The $130 million figure in the ledger isn't real, but it's true. It's the value of everything we never dared to love fully. If you're holding this, I'm asking you to do one thing. Live like the debt has already been forgiven. Don't measure yourself by what's missing. Measure yourself by what you give attention to. You come from a line of people who mistook guilt for duty. You can end that. Stay if you want. Leave if you must. Either way, the house will remember you. She read it twice, then a third time, until the words blurred. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, I forgive you. Then, quieter, and I forgive me. The room didn't change, but the air did. It felt cleaner, as if the house had been waiting for that sentence. The weeks that followed passed like slow healing. Clara began keeping her own journal, writing each night by candlelight. Not grand confessions, just small things she'd noticed. The way sunlight made the dust shimmer, the sound Jasper made when dreaming, the smell of pine after rain. Ordinary things, but each one proof that she existed beyond survival. One afternoon, she took the ledgers and wrapped them in fresh cloth. She labeled them the weight we measured and carried them to town. The woman at the Historical Society was kind, her hands gentle on the old pages. She promised to preserve them properly, to make sure the names inside wouldn't disappear again. Clara left without giving her last name. It felt right, like the story belonged to more than one family now. On her way back, she stopped by a hardware store. With the last of her savings, she bought a new lock for the door, a set of clean sheets, and a tin of blue paint. When she brushed it onto the porch railing, the color looked like morning sky trapped in wood. That night, she dreamed of her grandfather again. He was sitting at the same table, smiling, not the formal smile from the old photograph, but something softer. You found it? He said. The money? She asked. He shook his head. No, the answer. When she woke, the fog outside had lifted. For the first time, the valley below the ridge was visible. Fields, a line of river, a distant road. The world beyond the house felt reachable again. Spring came, quietly. Grass pushed through the snowmelt, and the air smelled of sap and thawing soil. Travelers began appearing on the back road. Hikers, lost tourists, people following signals from nowhere in particular. Sometimes they'd stop when they saw the blue-painted porch. Clara would offer them water, a sandwich, a warm place for the dog to rest. Some stayed an hour, some a night. She never asked their stories unless they wanted to tell them. Word spread. Locals started calling it the Forgiven House. They left donations sometimes, or notes folded into stones. Thank you for listening, or I needed this silence. Clara never corrected them when they assumed it was some kind of shelter. Maybe it was. Maybe that was what the $130 million had always been meant to build. Not a vault of gold, but a refuge made of understanding. By summer, the place had changed. Curtains fluttered in the windows. The chimney worked again. Flowers grew where old boards had rotted away. Jasper spent his days stretched out in sunlight, his fur finally thick and clean. One evening, as twilight sank into the pines, a stranger came walking up the path. He was in his 60s, thin, carrying a cane. His clothes were travel-worn, his eyes bright with recognition. "Is this the Hensley place?" he asked. "It is," Clara said. He nodded slowly, looking past her at the porch, the chimney, the faint glimmer of firelight. Inside. "My father used to work here," he said. "Said he never got paid, but he didn't hold it against them. Told me it wasn't about the money. It was about being seen." Clara felt something shift. "Then I think this house has been waiting for you." He smiled, that kind of quiet smile that doesn't need explanation, and they went inside. They talked for hours, about his father, about the years that had folded in on themselves. When he left, he said, "Tell whoever built this that the debt's been settled." "I think they already know," she said. That night, she wrote one last entry in her journal. "Today, I understood the secret. The 130 million was never a number. It was a map, back to grace. Grandpa's house wasn't haunted by debt. It was haunted by the belief that we had to earn our place here. But maybe love doesn't need to be earned. Maybe it just needs someone to stay long enough to notice it." She closed the book and placed it beside the ledgers on the shelf. Outside, the moonlight silvered the grass. The world was quiet, not empty. Jasper stirred, came to her side, and rested his head on her knee. She scratched behind his ear. "We did it," she whispered. "We finally stopped running." The wind moved through the pines like a sigh of contentment. She could almost imagine the house breathing along with it. When morning came, she stepped out onto the porch with her coffee and watched the fog dissolve. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a truck's engine hummed. A new day arriving, uninvited, but welcome. She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't need an audience. The fortune had been real after all, not in gold, not in bills, but in the simple arithmetic of redemption. A priceless ledger written in forgiveness and sunlight. She leaned against the railing, Jasper at her feet, and said quietly, "Grandpa, I found the treasure, and I spent it." The pines rustled like applause. The house, at last, was home.